Hey everyone, welcome back to the Dividend Talk YouTube channel. I'm Engineer My Freedom, and today I'm just going to talk a little bit about how to find your next dividend growth stock. Now this is probably aimed a little bit more at beginners. If you're starting, we get this question a lot on the podcast, and people are just unsure how to start picking their own stocks. Of course, there's plenty of ways out there if you don't want to do the work yourself, and I maybe mention one or two of those at the end. But if you're interested in some of the tools to maybe find your own watch list and start to build up your own portfolio, well, stay tuned. I will go through what I used and what I still use to this day. So just before I get started, if you do like the Dividend Talk podcast, if you like these YouTube videos, please hit that like button, and also maybe if you like, hit the subscribe button as well. We do really appreciate it. But without further ado, this is probably one of the best resources out there. It's dripinvesting.org. As you can see, there's from the screen, there's a lot of different tools, and most of them are free of charge. They have many different articles on starting in dividend investing. You got the Prudent Investors blog. I give you some useful books. There's a community message board and forum, which, to be honest, I have never really used. And then you have this information and tools and forums. Within there, you've got dividend spreadsheets to help you track your dividends. You've got dividend calendars. You've got analysis. And you've also got these US champions list and Canadian list. And this is probably one of the first places that I would recommend you starting. Is I would maybe read some articles and then just have a look at the spreadsheet. So I'll open up the one for the US dividend champions first of all. So if you open up the spreadsheet, I think it's a really good place to start. I know it can be a little bit overwhelming at the beginning, particularly because there's so many companies on here. So if you look down at the tabs, for example, you've got dividend champions, which have paid dividends or increased dividends for 25 years or more. You've got dividend contenders who have increased dividends between 10 and 25 years. Now you got your challengers, which have increased in between 0 and 10 years. So there's lots and lots of different companies here. You can view them all together. You can sort them by dividend yield. You can sort them by payout ratios, by PE ratios. There's tons and tons of different metrics here. My advice would be to maybe scan through it and pick maybe 3 or 4 companies that you are familiar with. I would not get too I would not get too bogged down worrying about yield and worrying about price and valuations at this moment. If you're beginning, I would just maybe download this file, get used to it, have a look at some of the companies and pick out 4 or 5 companies that you are familiar with and use that as your starting point. Metrics are good, and we all have some sort of metrics, but I've learned along the way that you can have certain metrics, like you can have, for example, a minimum starting yield of 3%, but then you might lose on some top quality companies such as Microsoft, whose starting yield is 1% maybe, but they have a far better dividend growth. So just be careful if you're using metrics. I would just use this to get to know the companies, pick some that you know, and then start your research from that point. One of the best places to go actually would be to Seeking Alpha, which is probably the first place I go after select a company. If you look at Seeking Alpha, you do have to pay for them. I don't pay. You get a certain amount of articles free per month. I can't remember if that's 3 or 4, but that's usually all I need at the moment. But what I do usually is I go on to the page such as Orange here, and I'll have a quick look at the summary, so you can see the share price summary here. You can get a view of the news that's happening on that company, some articles and analysis from writers on Seeking Alpha, and you can kind of tell the mood from the title, whether it's going to be upbeat or positive, or maybe they're not so positive about the company. So you can kind of get a feel for that. You can click in and read some of these. If you have the premium version, you can read all of these. If you have the free version like me, you have to be a little bit more selective. But I think it's a very good place to start. You have all sorts of ratings, which again, I don't use this page a whole lot, and it's probably for premium users. There's some quick financials here. I prefer to go to the real financial. So I prefer to go to the annual reports for the financials, because what I have found over the years is that some sites are accurate in some figures and they're not in others, and they can mix gap and non-gap, and sometimes it can get messy, so you're not quite sure what you're using, is it right? So I just prefer to maybe go to the annual reports and go back. It's a little bit more work and it takes a little bit more time, but you can be sure then that your data is right. But for a quick overview, somewhere like Seeking Alpha, Yahoo Finance, Morningstar are perfectly fine. You can 100% go in and see the trend of revenues, you can see the trend of cash flow, you can see all sorts of trends and ratios, and you can quickly make up your mind then if this is a company that you want to dig a little bit deeper into, or do you want to pass and maybe find someone else. It's also handy for earnings and upcoming earnings dates. So if you're tracking companies and you want to keep up to date on how they're performing each quarter, I don't really recommend that, honestly. I see this a lot on Twitter, I see it a lot on social media, where people are following a company on a quarter by quarter basis, and we all know that the market gets spooked quite easily. They might miss earnings by 2 cents, or they might say something in the report that might send analysts into some sort of hope and the price will drop. And as an investor, sometimes it is hard to block out all of the noise. So for me, I prefer, I do read quarterly reports. I do, because I have a blog and because I have a podcast and because I also write for Sure Dividend. But generally speaking, I don't pay too much attention to them. They're nice to give you sort of a feel of how the year is going, but the annual reports is where I focus most of my attention. Another good website that I use, it's quite a new website, and that is from IO Charts. As you can see, they have a clean interface. They give you lots of different parameters. You have stock charts, downside potential. They give you revenues by segments, geographical revenues, dividend yields. I mean, there's a whole host of metrics here that they show you, and I find it really good. I use this all the time on my blogs. I do wish that they had a little bit more European companies, and honestly, I've spoken to the guys behind this, but I've met them in person, and they are doing some fantastic work on this. They've added so much to it already, and they are trying their best to get some European companies there. But certainly for US companies, this is probably the second place I go. Straight after Seeking Alpha, I plug it in here, and it's just easy to see the trends and how it's performing. I definitely recommend it. They have a new screener in here as well if you want to screen for dividend stocks, depending on some of your metrics that you've set up. You can see if it matches with the CCC list, for example, that you downloaded earlier. Another one of these screeners then is Finviz, and that's quite popular. Again, it's free of charge. It's quite easy to use. I don't particularly use it for dividend growth stocks, but you can. There are all sorts of filters here. You can search by earnings, by cash flow. You can have a dividend yield. You can put in your debt, and so on. So it's a really good website. Sometimes I use it when I'm looking for option trades, or if I'm looking for something that I want to trade on a short-term basis. But it is certainly good at finding quality companies based on your own criteria. A lot of income investors probably focus on yield, and there is a tendency to focus on it a little bit too much. But with that, if you are interested in yield, you want to see the historical yield of a company, where they are now, is it above average or is it below average, then a really good place for this is yieldchart.com. You can put in any symbol you want, so we'll type in Johnson & Johnson, for example, and it will bring up their chart. It'll show you their current yield, which is 2.47%, and that is slightly above the average yield, which is 2.33%. So that might indicate then that this is an actual good time to get in from a yield perspective. I'm not saying it's a good time from financial perspective, but just based on yield, it looks like you're getting a good deal at 2.47%. Another place then that I personally go to when I'm looking for inspiration is I do go to other blogs. I mean, there's loads and loads of blogs out there. There's if you're looking for US stocks or Canadian stocks, you can find any screener you want, but you can't really find them for European stocks. It's really, really hard. You have to do a lot of work yourself. But luckily we've got people like European DJI, which you all know, who I share a podcast with. He does a lot of great work on European companies. He has the Noble 30 Index, where he has 30 European aristocrats. He puts a lot of work into this and keeping it up to date, and I think it's fantastic. Another blogger that really inspires me is the Decline Capitalist. Now, he does write in Dutch, so if you do want to read this, you will have to use Google Translate, but I mean, it translates absolutely fine. He is an encyclopedia of companies that I've just either never heard of or overlooked. He just has a fantastic knowledge of these companies. For example, he wrote one here about a semiconductor called Besoi, which honestly I've never heard of before. But he writes really well. He has a sense of humour, and it really comes across in his articles, even when you use Google Translate. So I would highly recommend checking that one out. And one of the others that I use is the European View. He's also an analyst on Seeking Alpha, so you can find him in both places. But again, focus here is on European companies. If you're looking for US, I mean, there's hundreds and hundreds of blogs out there. I couldn't possibly name them all. I know Dividend Power has one. My own friend Russ over in Dapper Dividends has a blog as well. There's lots and lots of different blogs out there, but particularly for European blogs, it's a little bit harder to come by. And then the last thing that I do personally then is I will take some of the figures from the annual reports. I used to use a service called TIKR, which is called TIKR, but they are now. You now have to pay for it. So it used to be free up until this year. It was free, and you could get detailed analysis back as far as maybe 10-15 years, particularly for European companies, which was quite good. I spent a lot of time going through both the annual reports of all the European companies in my portfolio and the information on TIKR, and it was always matching up pretty well. So I was quite confident in using them. They do now have a paywall up, so you can get US stocks for free, maybe for I think 5 years data, but after that you have to pay $14.95 a month. Honestly, I don't think I'll bother paying that amount of money, because that just eats into my dividend income. But it's still a handy tool if you want to use the last 5 years. But what I used to do is I used to copy these figures out of here. I put them into my fundamental analysis tracker. I had some a business model that I developed over time with a scoring system, and based on this scoring system, it gave me a rating between 0 and 100. It doesn't mean I always action. So, for example, if a company gave me 30, it doesn't mean I'm going to sell them straight away, but it does provide me as a useful tool to say, okay, there's something going wrong here. I need to actually look into the annual reports and see what is happening, why it's happening, and is it going to continue happening into the future? And if so, maybe then it's a case that I should sell. Or if it's something that it's just a blip, then maybe then I don't have to sell, but I just have to keep a closer eye on the company. So that's pretty much it. That's most of what I use on a day-to-day basis. Generally, by now I have my portfolio picked up, so I only add quite selectively. I'm trying to select companies that I know and that I own already. I want to keep them, but I'm looking at maybe more in the engineering field. I use companies like Schneider Electric, Rockwell, ABB. So those companies, Keyence as well, are companies that I'm interested in, because I know them quite well. I don't have to spend as much time researching what these companies do. I can just look straight into their financials and make a decision. So I'm going to focus a little bit more on companies like that. I don't need to go into the CCC list much anymore, but it is useful to have from time to time, particularly if I'm looking at different companies. But hey, that's it. I hope you found it a little bit useful. Maybe some of these that you use, maybe some you don't. I would also love to hear what you use, what tools you use, and maybe something that might help me. So if you could drop that in the comments below, I would much appreciate it. See you later.